welcome back to the deep dive. Now, if I asked you, who are the world's great lawgivers? Or maybe revolutionary thinkers? You might say Solon, maybe Plato, Confucius.
Sure, those names come up.
But I bet Moses wouldn't be, top of your list immediately.
And that, well, according to the deep dive we've done for today, that's kind of the whole point. We think we know the Moses story, right? Prophet, religious leader, led his people through the desert, 40 years.
Yeah, and that 40 years part, it's almost always framed as punishment for disobedience, lack of faith after Egypt.
That's the standard version, yeah, textbook stuff. But the thesis we're digging into today, it challenges that completely. It argues those 40 years weren't punishment at all.
Oh.
It was like this meticulously planned period of social and cultural education, really rigorous. The goal, to build a totally new kind of society.
Okay, hold on. Let's unpack that, because that's a huge shift in perspective.
Yeah.
You're saying Moses wasn't just delivering divine messages. He was acting as a social designer?
Essentially, yes. A revolutionary designer, crafting a whole political, economic, ethical system basically from the ground up. The sources we looked at call it a contract community.
A contract community. Okay. So he's engineering justice, building a society where holiness isn't about, say, performing rituals perfectly.
Exactly. It's about systemic justice. So our mission today is to explore that blueprint, the design for this, you could almost say, utopian vision. And it's mainly laid out in the contract law, especially in Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy is the operational manual.
Pretty much, yeah. The source material treats it that way. The guide for building this new holy culture. It's fascinating. We're looking at ancient theology through the lens of social design.
Right. So we need to look past the Sunday school stories, maybe, and see the architecture, the system Moses was building. Political theory, ethics, culture, all rolled into one.
That's quite a mix.
Okay, so where do we start? Every design project begins with the designer, right? Their background, their training, Moses' early life. I mean, he had incredible privilege, raised in the Egyptian palace, top-tier education.
The best you could get back then, yeah. He was an elite knowledge holder, groomed for power, essentially.
But the material we reviewed, it stresses that this exact privilege gave him a unique viewpoint. He didn't just see isolated acts of cruelty. He saw the whole operating system of Egypt was flawed.
Right. It wasn't just about one bad pharaoh being cruel. I mean, cruelty happens. Moses apparently saw that this cruelty wasn't an accident. It was baked into the system. It was normalized.
How so? Normalized by what?
By the theology itself.
Yeah.
By the social structure. The sources really dig into the religious setup of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the gods, the pantheon. They were basically seen as reflections or justifications of the ruling class.
So the pharaoh is a god, or chosen by the gods.
Exactly. And that divine stamp of approval, it sanctioned massive inequality. It wasn't just might makes right, it was the gods designed it this way. Slavery, the oppression of groups like the Habiru, it all had a spiritual green light.
Wow. Okay, so the system failure wasn't just bad politics. It was fundamentally a bad theology, one that offered zero hope for dignity or equality for the average person, the weak.
That's the key insight the source material highlights. Moses realized that any god, any religious system that basically rubber-stamped slavery and suffering, well, it couldn't be the foundation for a truly humane society.
So a political fix wasn't enough. Couldn't just swap out the king.
No. He had to replace the very foundation, find a new theology altogether, and that became his quest. A social contract grounded in the absolute equality and dignity of every single person, especially the most vulnerable.
Which completely reframes those next 40 years, right? His time in Midian, not just wandering in the desert.
Not at all. The source material calls it a critical period of education and training. He had to, detox from Egypt, unlearn everything.
That's a huge undertaking. Imagine the mental effort. Trained in Egyptian administration, hierarchy, now he has to invent a counterculture.
And the sources suggest this wasn't just divine dictation. It was more like a Socratic process. God letting Moses wrestle with the problems, figure out the solutions himself, a self-awakening.
40 years of intense philosophical workshopping, basically.
Pretty much. Deconstructing his whole worldview, then rebuilding it. And this led him to that encounter at the burning bush. And the name revealed there.
Yahweh.
Exactly. And the interpretation offered is really powerful. It links the name directly to this social mission. It describes a deity who intrinsically cares about the prosperity of everyone, not just the elite.
A god who feels the pain of the poor and marginalized.
Yes, actively shares in it. This deity's very identity is tied up with achieving justice on earth.
And what's striking is this wasn't just abstract theology. It immediately became the core principle for the new society he was designing.
It had to be. That was the whole point of the Exodus, the whole point of forming this nation, to establish this principle, live with the weak, achieve justice. That's the bedrock. Everything else, every law, every cultural practice was built on that foundation to protect the dignity of the vulnerable.
Okay, so the designer's educated, the core principle is set. Now, the design itself, you said Deuteronomy is the textbook, and the goal is this, educational republic. What did that even mean back then?
Yeah, educational republic. It captures the first and maybe the most radical pillar of the design. Universal high-level education for everyone, intellectually and ethically.
Universal high-level education, 3,500 years ago.
That's the claim. Moses apparently realized that a just society, a just republic, simply cannot work long-term unless the citizens themselves are capable of complex thought, deep moral reasoning. It's an idea way ahead of its time.
That is stunning, because ancient empires, Egypt, Babylon, they worked by limiting knowledge, right? Keeping literacy and analysis skills confined to a small elite, scribes, priests.
Exactly. That's how you maintain control. Giving every single citizen the ability to read, to analyze, to debate the law. That's decentralizing power at the most fundamental level. Moses wanted the entire nation, regardless of status, to have the intellectual tools usually reserved for the ruling class.
And you see this clearly in that famous Shema command. Teach these words diligently to your children, talking about them constantly.
We often hear that as just, moral lessons or memorizing verses.
Right.
But the source material looks really closely at the Hebrew. That phrase, discussing the word, it argues it meant way more than rote learning. It meant full literacy, deep comprehension, and crucially, the ability for the entire population to engage in serious, reasoned discussion and debate about the law.
So not just knowing the rules, but wrestling with them, understanding the why, being able to argue about it.
Precisely. Active intellectual engagement. Moses wasn't aiming for passive followers. He was aiming for citizens capable of critical thinking, of dialectic, of independent ethical judgment.
Think about the skills that requires. Analyzing complex legal texts, debating fine points. In the ancient world, that was purely the domain of professional scribes, the state administrators.
And Moses set that as the standard for every man, woman, and child.
Hang on. How realistic was that? I mean, even today, getting universal, high-level philosophical literacy, it's a massive challenge. Was the idea that suddenly everyone becomes an amateur constitutional lawyer?
The aspiration was definitely that high. It shows the level of intellectual responsibility Moses expected. He wanted a community where everyone understood the social contract and, importantly, could hold leaders and each other accountable to it, to the justice principles in Deuteronomy.
Because otherwise...
Otherwise, power and understanding inevitably drift back to a small, educated elite, and you end up right back with the Egyptian model he was trying to escape. Failure to educate everyone was seen as the slippery slope back to oppression.
So it wasn't about forced memorization like some national pledge.
No, the sources contrast it with exactly that. Authoritarian regimes demand rote learning. Moses wanted self-governing, thinking citizens. This universal education was the insurance policy against tyranny.
Okay, so a foundation of universal literacy. But how does this educated nation actually organize itself? Politically, religiously. And this leads us to maybe the most provocative claim in this whole analysis about the rituals.
Yeah, this is where it directly challenges a lot of traditional understanding. The sources argue that the Tabernacle, the portable sanctuary in the wilderness, and all the complex sacrificial rituals described in texts like Leviticus, they were temporary. Educational tools, teaching materials. The source uses the term unki. And the intention was that they would be abolished or at least significantly downplayed once the Israelites were settled in the Promised Land and living out the just society.
Whoa, okay. Abolished. That's huge. Because that implies that the later focus on the temple in Jerusalem, the whole centralized system, that was actually a step backward, a failure to follow the original plan.
That's the core of the argument. It's based on comparing the texts. Deuteronomy, seen as the final long-term instruction manual, has surprisingly few detailed rules about building a tabernacle or doing complex sacrifices. If those things were meant to be the absolute, eternal center of the faith, wouldn't the main manual spend a lot of time on them? The relative silence is interpreted as evidence. Evidence that they were like scaffolding, meant to come down once the just society was standing on its own.
But I mean, history shows they didn't abolish it. They built a massive temple. Doesn't that kind of undermine this interpretation? Maybe the source is reading too much into Moses' original intent.
or
But it's
ignoring the political realities.
That's a fair question. Historical reality versus original blueprint. The argument here is that Moses' true vision wasn't centered on a building or elaborate ceremonies. It was centered on a community whose holiness came from practicing justice and equity every day,
Yeah.
guided by the contract law in Deuteronomy.
The community itself is the sanctuary. The law is the ritual. In essence, yes, daily ethical living was the core practice. Deuteronomy was the guide for that.
Okay, but if you ditch the central temple, the central rituals, how do you maintain unity? How do you handle justice? How do you keep up that intense educational focus without a central hub?
Right. And that brings us to the second part of this, radical decentralization. The model wasn't a capital city with one big temple. It was a distributed network, local centers for learning and community life.
And the Levites are key to this, right? The priestly tribe.
Absolutely key, but not in the way you might expect. They were specifically prevented from becoming a centralized power block. They didn't get one big chunk of land.
Okay.
Instead, they were told to disperse, to live in 48 designated hub cities spread out across the entire territory.
48 cities. And the sources mention the territory size, like a medium-sized state or region today. So these hubs would be reasonably accessible to everyone.
That seems to be the idea. These weren't just religious centers. They were hubs for education, justice, community life. The Levites' main job in these places, teaching and interpreting the law, making sure the principles of the contract law were alive in local communities, in farming, in business deals, everything.
So the focus shifts from Jerusalem, from one building, to everywhere, embedded in local life.
It's about diffusing power and knowledge. It's grassroots, designed explicitly to stop power concentrating in one place, because Moses knew from Egypt what that leads to.
Oppression, hierarchy.
Exactly. This decentralized model. It's considered one of the earliest attempts at local self-governance in history. Communities interpreting and applying the law for themselves, with the Levites as guides, as teachers. The structure itself was meant to prevent another Egypt.
This blueprint is incredibly detailed. So we've got universal education, radical decentralization. What's Pillar 3? How does the community actually internalize this justice? Not just know it intellectually, but feel it.
Ah, yes. The festivals. This is maybe one of the most ingenious parts of the design. Moses, or the design reflected in Deuteronomy, understood that ethics aren't just learned from books, they have to be experienced. So the festivals were repurposed.
Repurposed how?
They became mandatory, hands-on training sessions specifically for empathy and solidarity. They moved beyond just remembering history to actually feeling shared experiences, often uncomfortable ones.
Okay, give me an example. Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We know the story. Escaping Egypt. But the bread, the matzah, eating that for a week.
Right. And the source insists we shouldn't just think, oh, they left in a hurry. Matzah was the bread of affliction. It was the simplest, roughest, cheapest food, the kind the very poorest people scraped together, maybe ground quickly at sunset for their only meal.
So forcing everyone, rich, poor, everyone, to eat this for a week.
It was mandatory sensory immersion. You had to physically experience, even for just a week, the reality of the poorest members of your community. It wasn't optional.
Mandated empathy through diet.
Wow. And the lesson that went with it was explicit. If your kids, used to better food, complained, the parents were supposed to explain, the reason we have prosperity now, it's not just for us. It's so we can solve the problems of neighbors who are struggling like this.
Redirecting gratitude. Away from just, thank God I'm well off, towards, thank God we have resources to help others.
Precisely. And it didn't stop at feeling. The festival culminated in action.
How so?
You had to actively invite the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger into your home. To share the festival meal together, the empathy had to translate directly into sharing resources, sharing space.
Okay, I see the pattern. And the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, living in temporary hut.
Same principle. Leave your solid, comfortable house, spend a week in a flimsy booth exposed to the elements, heat, cold, dew.
Why?
Intensive training, the source argues, to feel the sorrow of the homeless, to internalize that having a secure home isn't some inherent individual right. It's a blessing tied directly to your responsibility to help solve the housing problems of others in the community.
So these festivals are like annual ethical resets, designed to prevent people from getting too comfortable, too insulated by wealth, forcing the comfortable to feel the vulnerability of others.
Exactly. Breaking down class barriers through shared, mandated discomfort. And crucially, the source points out, these rituals were designed to steer faith away from being transactional.
Transactional meaning.
Meaning, I do this ritual, I give this sacrifice so God will give me a personal blessing. No, these festivals were purely about cultivating ethical responsibility, social solidarity.
And I remember the source mentioned something about complaining during the festival,
Oh,
about the food maybe.
yeah, apparently complaining about the simple food or the discomfort, that was seen as fundamentally missing the point, an attitude totally incompatible with this contract community.
Because it showed you hadn't grasped the core ethos.
Yeah,
Shared struggle, shared gratitude, shared responsibility.
exactly. The whole system was designed so that accepting God's provision meant you also accepted the duty to extend that provision to everyone else. That was the holiness.
Okay, this ethical framework is intense. It needs an economy to back it up, right?
Hmm.
Which brings us to Pillar 4, the economic system. The source material has this really unique take on tithes and first fruits, this Manmul-Bongwan system.
Yes, Manuel Bangwan. And it's crucial to understand this wasn't just charity, and it wasn't a flat tax like we usually think of tithe. It was the actual economic foundation for communal survival. Mutual aid built right into the system.
So how did it work differently from, say, a standard 10% tithe?
Well, the key difference, it wasn't a fixed percentage at all. It was entirely driven by need. The process started with the community assessing its collective situation.
How?
Often led by the local Levites, they'd figure out the total need. How many families had crop failures? Who was sick, unable to work? Who lost livestock? Who's landless? They calculated the overall community deficit first.
Calculate the need before anyone gives anything. That's backward to how we usually think of donations.
Completely flips the script. Only after the total community need was known were individuals expected to contribute. And what did they contribute? Their surplus.
Surplus meaning.
Whatever was left over after their own family's needs were met, food, shelter, basic security for the year, whatever was genuinely extra went into the communal pot to cover the calculated deficit.
So it's a system designed to ensure collective survival comes before individual hoarding.
Pretty much. It's a mandatory, demand-driven, mutual aid safety net. It's basically love your neighbor as yourself, implemented as concrete economic policy.
And calling it mutual aid or social insurance feels right.
Yeah.
Because it acknowledges that anyone could face hardship next year.
Exactly. Contributing your surplus wasn't seen as just charity for them. It was an investment in the whole community's stability, which included your own future security. If the system protected the weakest link, the whole chain was stronger.
Was there a connection to, like, divine blessing? How did this practical economics link to faith?
Oh, absolutely. A profound connection. The sources argue this system was the way the community experienced God's promise of abundance. Remember the manna in the wilderness?
Yeah, daily provision based on need.
Right. So by giving away your surplus to meet the community's needs, you were actively participating in that divine economy. You were trusting the promise, that idea of blessings poured out until there is no room to receive it. You lived it out economically.
So hoarding your extra stuff would be like signaling you don't trust the system, don't trust the covenant promise.
That seems to be the implication. But sharing your surplus, that meant you were acting as an agent of God's provision. You were ensuring collective security, which was the experience of abundance. Faith wasn't just believing God provides for me, it was believing God provides through our commitment to each other.
Through justice and mutual responsibility.
Yes. The community itself becomes the channel of provision. It's a total reversal of the Egyptian model, where piling up wealth showed divine favor. Here, distributing wealth showed covenant faithfulness.
And that economic act, sharing the surplus,
Yeah.
that becomes the most important ritual.
Yeah.
More important than burning incense or sacrificing an animal.
Arguably, yes,
Yeah.
because it directly fulfilled the prime directive, living justly with the weak. It made holiness structural, economic, not just a feeling or a ceremony.
Okay, let's recap this vision because it's massive. A whole culture engineered around universal high-level education for all.
Yeah.
Radical political decentralization through these local hub cities. Mandatory empathy training built into the festivals.
Experiential ethics.
And this needs-based mutual insurance economic system, all flowing from Deuteronomy's contract law. It really is, as the sources claim, an incredible piece of social design.
It's a blueprint that still feels radical today in many ways. But here's the kicker. The sources spend a lot of time not just on the brilliance of the vision, but on its historical failure.
Failure.
Yeah. The argument is that the actual history of Israel, for the most part, is a story of failing to implement this grand decentralized design.
How did they fail? What went wrong?
They basically drifted back towards the model Moses was trying to escape. Centralization. Ritual over justice. They demanded a king, creating a monarchy.
Which centralizes power.
Exactly. And eventually, worship and power got concentrated in Jerusalem around a single, incredibly elaborate temple. They traded the decentralized, education-focused model for elite control and a top-down structure.
So the famous Temple of Solomon. From this perspective, that wasn't the pinnacle of faith, but actually a sign of decay, a betrayal of the original Deuteronomic vision.
That's the provocative argument, yes.
Yeah.
They swapped the living practice of justice embedded in the community for, architectural splendor and complex rituals that maybe obscured the core ethical demands.
And this is what the prophets were so angry about. We read Amos, Isaiah, Micah.
We often think of them as predicting the future, but the sources frame them differently. Their main job was calling people back to the original contract in Deuteronomy.
Back to social justice, equality, real-world ethics.
Yes. When they say things like, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, they're directly condemning the drift towards ritual without justice. They were the last champions, in a way, of this educational republic idea, arguing that the ceremonies were empty if the poor were being crushed.
But they didn't succeed in turning things around, ultimately.
No, the system largely continued its regression, and this historical failure becomes the basis in the source material for a really sharp critique of religion today.
Oh, so what's the modern connection?
Well, the warning is pretty stark. The language gets intense. It basically says, if any modern faith, whatever its name, ignores this core covenant essence, the demand for concrete social responsibility, for realizing justice in society, if it focuses only on personal salvation or beautiful buildings or correct rituals, then it's committing a fundamental breach of contract.
Breach of contract, that's strong. And the source uses even harsher language, right?
Yeah.
Comparing it to...
Yes, likening that kind of failure piety without social justice to the work of the devil servant or the voice of the demon. It's suggesting that faith disconnected from systemic justice isn't just incomplete. It might actually be working against the original revolutionary design.
Wow. Okay, so it completely forces us to rethink what religious success even looks like. If the original goal was this just society, living with the weak, then where do we find holiness today?
Is it in these systems of mutual responsibility, collective justice, universal education, radical decentralization? Or is it primarily in our buildings, our ceremonies, our individual feelings?
That's the challenge, isn't it? This thousands-year-old blueprint asking us about our priorities right now. Personal piety versus systemic responsibility. Have we missed the point of the original contract?
It certainly makes you think. We've unpacked this incredible vision of Moses the designer, a society demanding intellectual depth and deep empathy from every single citizen.
It's a stunning concept of community. So next time, what happens when they actually try to implement this?
Right. Next time, we'll trace that historical path. What happened when the Israelites entered Canaan? How did this revolutionary vision play out on the ground? How did it get changed, compromised? And why, according to this analysis, did it ultimately fail to take root in the way it was designed?
Looking forward to that.
Until then, maybe chew on that idea of the educational republic, like a society where the ultimate achievement isn't a grand temple, but a just framework for living together.